you. Zrat Hashem.
Yes, yes. Okay. Everyone should be happy. Everyone should be great.
Hey,
Okay. We are in. Um, I saw your son-in-law David this morning. By the way, he's here behind me. By the way.
I'm so
Okay.
happy to hear that.
Yes. Okay. So we are on 41B. We're moving along. They say slow and steady wins the race, right? So as long as we are steady, we can win the race. Okay. 41B1. So the last thing, yesterday we introduced the Mishnah. The Mishnah stated that if you have a kettle, let's say a pot that contains hot water that you remove from the fire on the Shabbat. That seems to be the case that we're talking about. Really, it could be if you removed it right before Shabbat, would be the same story. And what's the issue? The question, the Mishnah states you can't put cold water into that kettle. Now, the question in the Gemara is that kettle, do you still have water in the kettle, or did you empty the contents of the kettle? Is the kettle empty, but just boiling hot because it was on the fire? And therefore, you can't put cold water into that kettle because the cold water will be heated up. Adam, if you want to send to the group that we're on, because the cold water will be heated up from the heat of that's contained in the walls of the pot that you just empty the contents of the hot water. Or is the case of the Mishnah talking about that you did not empty the contents of the water that's in the kettle? You just remove the kettle from the fire, and there's still hot water in that kettle. And the law is you can't put cold water, a little bit of cold water in it, because the cold water will be heated up from the hot water that's in the kettle. Those are the two possibilities of understanding the case of the Mishnah. So we had Rav Ada Bamatna. Rav Ada Bamatna understands that the case of the Mishnah is that you remove the water from the kettle. And the issue of the Mishnah is that now that you remove the water from the kettle, Adam, right? Jaime, now the walls are boiling hot of the kettle. So even though there's no water in the kettle, no hot water left, but the heat that's retained in the walls are boiling hot. And if you put some cold water, a little bit of cold water in, that little bit of cold water will be heated up and will be cooked. And therefore, that will be a violation on Shabbat of cooking water. So therefore, he understands the Mishnah says the following. You can't put a minimal amount, a small amount of water into that hot pot that's empty, but you could put a large amount. You could pour a large amount in at one shot, not a little bit, little bit, little bit. Pour a lot in, large amount at one shot into that empty pot. Because you're pouring a lot in at one time, the walls will not be able to cook up that water that's coming in. So you're allowed, the Mishnah saying you can't pour in a minimal amount of water, you can pour in a large amount of water, and that will be fine. That's how he understands the Mishnah. And what's the reason why you want to pour in a lot of water? Because let's say it's cold and you want to take off some of the chill of the water. So you can pour into this kettle a large amount of water at one time. Again, if the kettle will be on the fire, you would never be allowed to pour in a lot of water, even a lot of water, because it looks like you're cooking. And anyways, if you pour in a lot of water, because if it's on the fire, it actually will cook eventually. That water that you place on the fire will cook, even though it might not cook the second you pour it in on top of the, on top of the, the second you put it. If you put in a lot of water, it won't cook. But obviously, it's going to cook if it's on top of the fire. So we're talking about it's off the fire, and you emptied out the contents of the pot, it's just a pot with no water left, but it's the heat that's retained in the walls of the pot that you have to be worried about. And therefore, you can put a lot of water at one time. The Gemara challenged this on 41b1 on the top of the page. The Gemara challenged, what if isn't that mitzaref? You are hardening the steel of the kettle by pouring if you put if the kettle is empty and no longer has any water in it, but by pouring, even if you pour a lot of water in that kettle at one time, which Rav Ada understands you could do, but you are hardening the steel, and that will be a malacha on Shabbat, like Mark spoke about, with the blacksmith or whatever, when you make it the iron, and afterwards you put it into the water, to keep, to close the pores of the metal, meaning to say, as Rashi explains, that when you have a metal that's boiling hot, it now becomes it's softened as a result of the heat, and you need the water to pour the water on it to take away the softness. To the cold water will harden it. So it's like makabe patish, it's like you're finishing a utensil, you're making the utensil, you're fixing the utensil, and that will be a problem on Shabbat. So it's good you got rid of you addressed the issue of cooking the water, meaning if you put a lot of cold water into this empty boiling hot pot, if you put a lot of cold water at one time, that cold water won't cook up because the pot is off the fire, and you put a lot of water in simultaneously at one time. But the Gemara by is challenging, you have a different issue on your hands, or not the Gemara is challenging. You have a different issue. You have an issue of hardening the steel. We got to go down to Pittsburgh, steel country. I'll talk about some expo. So that is the Gemara's question. So what does the Gemara say? So the Gemara responds that Avada understands that the author of the Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon, right? Rabbi Shimon holds Dava, that's the top of the page on 41a, 41ab. The Rabbi Shimon, the Amad Dava she'emet chavein mutar. Right, that's a very famous, that's a big discussion in the Masechta Shabbat. It's a very famous opinion that he holds that if you do an act on Shabbat and you're not intending to do a malacha, you're not intending to do a work on Shabbat, you're not intending to violate the Shabbat. Let's say over here, when you're if you poured a lot of cold water into this empty tea kettle, you're not intending for the purpose of hardening the steel. You're intending for the purpose of taking off the chill of the water, on the cold water. Being that that's the case, so he says there is no problem of pouring the large amount of cold water at once into this empty hot pot, provided the commentators say that it's not a psik reishat, that it's not definite that you are going to harden the steel as a result of this. Meaning, even if you know that that 100%, let's say, it's automatically you're going to go ahead and harden the steel. It doesn't make a difference if you don't have that intention. But the fact that you're definitely doing an act of work on Shabbat, even if you don't have the intention to do it, meaning a person goes ahead and he says, you know what, I want to cut the head off of a chicken, but I don't want to kill the chicken. Killing a chicken on Shabbat is one of the 39 malachot. You're not allowed to do slaughtering on Shabbat, taking a life on Shabbat. So if a person says, you know what, good morning, Simon. I don't intend to take the life of the chicken. I just want to cut the head off. So now, are you going to tell me if you cut the head of the chicken, it's not going to die? So I'm not intending to kill the chicken, but you're going to kill the chicken. So you can't, even if you're not intending to kill, that's called, you still can't do it if you know what's going to happen. That's the expression, psik reisha. Psik Reisha means the cutting of Reisha, like rosh, of cutting of the head. Like Psik Reisha v'lo yamut. If you cut the head of the chicken, it's not going to die. So therefore, if it would be a Psik Reisha, if you would know that you're going to do the act of hardening the steel through this action, you would not be able to do this, even if you're not intending to harden the steel, even if your intention is just to take off the chill. But it's not necessarily that every time you cook, you empty the contents of a hot boiling pot, that steel needs hardening. Sometimes it might need hardening. Sometimes it might not need hardening. Depends on different things. Um, you know, it could be that the steel got very good the last time maybe the last time you poured the water, cold water on it, during the weekdays, and maybe you did such a good job in hardening the steel. So therefore, it might not be subject to the hardening. You might actually do the act of hardening the steel. Good morning, Akiva.
Morning, Rabbi.
Morning. So therefore, sometimes the commentaries say sometimes you don't heat it up enough that it would reach the level that that as a result of the pouring of the cold water on this empty pot, that it will actually harden it. Sometimes you have to when it reached a certain level of heat, then maybe that would cause that now it needed the pouring of the cold water, but maybe it didn't reach that level, that point. So it's not definite. Every time you pour out the contents of a boiling pot, it's not definite that you're actually fixing the pot. Morning, Ezra, by pouring that cold water onto the pot. So the fact that it's not a definite is enough to make it not a psik reisha. It's not definitely doing an act of violation of Shabbat. Simon, I'm going to give you another case. The famous case of could he take a chair or a bed outside, in the dirt floors or whatever, and you want to move the bed or the chair from point A to point B. So Reb Shimon says you could move the bed. Now the bed has, let's say it has iron, the bottom of the bed, the iron frame. And not necessarily when you move the bed, not all the time when you move the bed, it makes a groove in the ground. Sometimes it depends on the type of ground it is, depends on heavy, how the strength of you moving it. It's not always you're making a groove that's considered significant that you are softening the soil, which would be a violation of plowing on Shabbat. Right? One of the third malachot on Shabbat, you can't plow. So, and plowing basically is the softening of the ground. You soften the ground, right? What does the plow do? It softens the ground. Now you can plant, you can put the seeds in, and so on and so forth. It's not definite that when you drag the bed, it's going to do that to the ground. Maybe sometimes, yes. Maybe. I'm giving a guess. 75% yes, 25% no. And today the world is betting on everything. It's crazy. They'll bet on dragging of the bed. They'll bet how many times the president blows his nose. You know what I'm saying? It's a crazy situation. The betting is totally out of hand. That what they bet on today. So it's not definite that you're going to make the groove. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon says you could move that bed on Shabbat or that chair. It's not definite you're going to do this act of this malacha of softening the soil.
All up in the house has the time.
Right. So therefore, you wouldn't have any problem. Right. So even the other opinion.
Carry.
Say it again.
You don't plow when you move it in the house.
Right.
But you have the provision of carry.
Okay, so carrying in a house, you're allowed to carry inside a house. See what you said, maybe outside, you're bringing a good point. Maybe it's my backyard, so there's no, let's say it's not a problem of carrying. there's no issue of carrying, but the question is, am I softening? And in my house, even Rabbi Yehuda, who says you can't do it outside, he would hold if it's carpeted or if it's tiled, there shouldn't be any problem inside, unless he makes a zera, unless he makes a fence. If you allow inside, you allow outside. I'm not sure. We have to look that up. But the bottom line is, if it would be definite when I'm dragging the bed that it's going to make a groove in the ground, even if Shimon would say I can't do it, even though I'm not intending to do it. So that's the Gemara is saying over here. The Gemara is saying over here that since it's not definite that I'm going to harden the steel by pouring the cold water on this empty pot, that I emptied the contents out, therefore I'm allowed to pour this large amount of cold water on Shabbat into this pot that I had emptied on Shabbat, that's boiling hot, because this large amount of water is going to overpower whatever heat that's retained in the pot, and it's not going to cook up the water, right? But again, it's off the fire, the contents of the pot has been removed, and I put in a lot of water at one time. That's what the Gemara said. Now, let's go back, let's go to the point on 41A2. Go back, that's the intro. Go back to this point. Maskevla Abaye. It's about 41B1. I am sorry. 41B1. Maskevla Abaye. It's about first column, about 3 or 4 paragraphs, right? You have it, Ezra? You got a Maskevla Abaye? But from the top of the page, it's about 10 lines from the top of the page, right? 41B1. So Maskevla Abaye, so Abaye is challenging the case. Meaning, Rav Ada, you're explaining the case of the Mishnah. By the way, I went to visit Mr. Haber in his office last week. He sends regards. Simon, he sends regards. Manny Haber sends regards to everybody. Adam? Kiva, he told me to say. Yeah, he looks good. Yeah, thank God. He should be well. So he's challenging. You're telling me the case is that you remove the contents of the pot. There's no water left in the pot on the Shabbat, but it's still very hot because it had a minute ago, it had hot water in it. And that's the case of the Mishnah discussing. I can't put a little bit of water into that empty pot, right, Ezra? Because I put a little bit of cold water into that empty pot that's boiling hot because a minute ago it had boiling hot water. That little bit of water will be cooked from Morris, will be cooked from the walls of that empty pot. But I can put a lot of water in at one time because a lot of water will overpower the heat that's contained in the walls, and the heat that's in the walls will not cook that large amount of water. So in honor of Morris, we are on 41B1. First column, Maskevla Abaye. Abaye asked, first of all, a Chodesh Tov, everybody. Maskevla Abaye. First about the third or fourth paragraph, Maskevla Abaye. Abaye challenges. He says, Midei mecham shepina mimena mayim ketani. Does the Mishnah say that we're talking about a kettle that you emptied the water? The Mishnah doesn't say the Mishnah doesn't say a kettle that you emptied the water. Doesn't say that. What does it say? It just says mecham shepinu ketani. A kettle that was cleared, that was removed. Meaning the kettle, I can't see Mars's beautiful face. Thank you very much. The kettle that you removed, meaning you didn't empty the contents of the kettle. Just to bring everybody up to date. We're talking, Abaye wants to say, there's a new case. That's not the case of the Mishnah is different. You came in at a very good point. New case. You know what the case of the Mishnah is talking about? You have a boiling pot of water that was cooking. You put it up before Shabbat. You're allowed to do that. It was cooking before Shabbat. You put it up before Shabbat. Now you take the pot on Shabbat off the fire and you put it on your counter. Can I put cold water into that boiling pot of water? What are you going to say, Mars? No, I'm going to cook. If I put cold water into that boiling pot of water, even though it's not on the fire, it's still boiling. And that pot will cook up if I put cold water into the pot. So that's what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah is telling you, even though the water is not on the fire, you still can't put a small amount of water into that pot. Because if you put if you put an ounce, 2 ounces, 3 ounces, 4 ounces of water into a pot that contains 50 ounces of water or a large amount of water, that large amount of water that's in the pot is going to cook that small minimum amount of cold water that you're placing into that pot. And that will be cooking on Shabbat. Remember, the pot that you took off the fire that's boiling hot, it's called a Kli Rishon. It's the original source. Remember, it was heated up on the fire. The walls contain that heat because it was heated up on the fire, and therefore you can't put a little bit of water into that pot. But the Mishnah says, according to Abayi's understanding, if let's say the pot contains a certain amount of water, if I'm going to overpower the hot water in the pot by pouring out a gallon of water, a large amount. Well, let's say take the pitcher. I'm pouring a pitcher of water. Let's say the pot is a small pot, right? And I pour in I put in a lot of water, not drippings of water at one time. I pour in a large amount of water at one time. So that water that I put in is not going to get cooked. If I put it's
also kind of cooking.
Oh, very good. Cooling off is not cooking. Cooking, the water will be cooking. If you boil the water, it's cooking. If you don't boil water on Shabbat, if you take off the chill of water, now of course you can't go ahead and take a pot of water and on Shabbat say, you know what, I'm put it on a fire that I put on before Shabbat, and I'll just take off the chill and then I'll remove it from the fire. Before it reaches cooking, because that looks like cooking, and you might forget and you might leave it there and you might actually do cooking, right? If you put a pot just to take off the chill, you might leave it there on the fire, right? But Simon, here it's not a concern that I might leave it there and it'll lead to cooking. I'm actually taking a pot of water, a small pot of water, and I'm throwing in a gallon of water, it's coming in, boom. So when it rushes in, that water that's coming in has no time to get cooked because I put so much in at one time, it's not going to get cooked.
Boom, pulling it off.
So what's happening is that water is actually is going to get a little bit of heat, minimal amount of heat from the water that's in the pot, because the water in the pot is still boiling hot water. But what's actually happening is it's making the water that I'm putting in a little bit lukewarm or semi-warm or very minimally warm, but it's not reaching any part of that water that I'm throwing in is not getting cooked. Adam, you hear the case? Is that clear, Morris? So that's how Abaye understands the case of the Mishnah. So that's what the Gemara says. Elam Abaye, hachikama. Abaye says, Mecham shepinuhu. If you remove the kettle from the fire, v'yesh bo mayim chamin, and you have boiling hot water in this pot that you just removed from the fire, lo yitein l'tocha mayim muatim. Don't put in a small amount of water because a small amount of water will cook up in this pot. But what can you do? You can't put driplets and small amounts of water. You could put in a large amount of water. Kedei lahafshiran. You want to go ahead and make it a little bit warm, to warm it a little bit, but not to cook it. You could put in a large amount of water. Now, so the Gemara says, but the Mishnah is only allowing a situation where you're pouring a lot of water into a minimal amount of water. But what about if you empty the contents of the pot completely? Meaning you had this boiling hot pot of water and you emptied out, you poured it into the sink, you emptied it out. Can I put a lot of hot water into this pot? For sure, I can't put a little bit of can't put a lot of cold water. I can't put a little bit of cold water into an empty, boiling hot pot. But the pot a minute ago contain. You ever see a pot that had hot stuff in it? Now you emptied out the pot, steaming, and it's going to cook up to a little bit of water. But can I put a lot of water in? So you can say, Rabbi, what's the problem? If I put a lot of water in, a lot of water is going to overpower the heat that's contained in the walls, and it's not going to get cooked. So it's just going to get warm. That might be true. But are we concerned for hardening the steel? Because when you have an empty pot that was once boiling hot, and now you empty the contents, so many times the steel of the pot becomes softened, and by pouring cold water into it, you're hardening it, you're making it better. Now, would the Mishnah be concerned about that problem? So that's what the Gemara is saying. Abaye is saying, his understanding is that the Mishnah is concerned, because since there are times that it would get hardened, steel would be benefited, you're improving the steel by the fact that you pour large amounts of cold water into an empty boiling pot that you just had hot water and then you empty the contents. So therefore, the Mishnah would forbade you from doing that, because we're concerned you're going to be doing the act of hardening the steel. And even though you're not intending to harden the steel, you'll be intending just to make the water, take the chill off the water. But he holds like Rabbi Yehuda that Davat, even if you don't have intention to do an act of violating the Shabbat, even if you're not intending to do an act of work, of labor on Shabbat, but the fact that it has a good possibility of being done, even though it's not definite, and even though you're not intending to do it, it's still forbidden to do an act, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that has the possibility of being an act of labor on Shabbat. And you might be doing an act of hardening the steel, which is one of the violations of Shabbat, if you're accomplishing that. But you might not be actually doing that. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that if you might be doing an act of hardening the steel, you can't do something, even though you're not intending for that. So that's what the Gemara wants to say. If you empty the contents of the pot, and now it's just boiling without anything in it, you can't put even a lot of water into it, because you're hardening the steel. You might be hardening the steel. Rabbi Yehuda, excuse me, it's the opinion of Yehuda that says if you do an act on Shabbat, and that you're not intending to do the actual violation of the work of Shabbat, the malacha of Shabbat, but it has that act could be, you might be doing an act of work on Shabbat, you can't do it. Rabbi Yehuda would say the same thing with the case that I gave you before. If you're outside in your backyard and you want to move a chair, the chair has, let's say, strong spikes on the bottom of your chair, let's say metal, and it might make a groove in the ground when you're moving the chair or the bed from point A to point B. It might make a groove, which would be a violation of Shabbat, of softening the soil, which would be like a violation of plowing. But it might not make Ezra a groove in the ground. Rabbi Yehuda says the fact that you might be making a groove, you can't do it. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't do it. I think the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon, that you could do it, because you're not intending to make a groove, and it's not definite that a groove is going to be made. So therefore, he says, but the Gemara is taking the position, Abaye is understanding that the author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, that we are strict. You can't go ahead on Shabbat and do an act that might be a violation of Shabbat, even though it's not definite, and even though you're not intending to do that. Okay? Now comes the Gemara, another point. Amar Rav. Rav is now clarifying the Mishnah. Let's see how he understands the Mishnah. So far, we had Rav Ada, Bar Ava, Bamatna, Rav Ada's opinion, and we had Abaye's opinion, right? So we have so far at this point of the Gemara, we have a disagreement between Rav Ada and Abaye in their understanding of the Mishnah, and the difference between both opinions would be whether you could pour a large amount of cold water into an empty pot that you would just empty the contents of boiling hot water. Can you pour a lot of water into that pot? One opinion would say you can, because you're not intending to harden the steel and it's not definite. And one opinion would say you can't, because you might be hardening the steel and therefore you can't do it. So that would be the two opinions in our Gemara. Now let's see where Rav and Shmuel, where they come on the board. Omar Rav, so Rav says, Lo shanu ela lahafshir. Rav understands you could place the allowance that you could put a lot of cold water is talking about a case when you have water in the pot. So you have boiling hot water in a pot, and you're putting a lot of cold water into that boiling pot of water. So then you could do it, because since you're putting a lot of water in, the water is a lot of cold water is not going to get cooked. It overpowers whatever water is left in the pot. But if there would not be any water left in the pot, and you empty the contents of the pot, then you would not be able to pour a lot of cold water in. L'tzareif, asur, it would be forbidden, like Abaye's position, that you're coming to because of the concern of hardening the pot. You will not be able to pour a lot of cold water into this empty pot. However, Shmuel says, Afilu tzarif nami mutar. Shmuel says you could even put a large amount of water into this pot, which seems to be that he's understanding that, like the other opinion, that since you're not intending to harden the pot, and it's not definite that you're going to harden the pot, you could do it even if you could pour a lot of cold water into this empty pot. But the Gemara has a question. Shmuel says even l'tzarif, it's mutter. The language of Shmuel sounds like you're actually intending to harden the pot. How could you do that if you're intending to harden the pot? You know what it would allow you to harden. Even if you hold when you don't have intention to do, the allowance that you could go ahead and that maybe you could go ahead and throw a lot of hot water in this empty pot would only be when you're not intending to do the act of the malacha of hardening. Meaning the allowance to drag if I want to drag a bed or a couch outside from point A to point B, which Reb Shimon says you're allowed to do it, is because I'm not intending to make the groove. It's not definite I'm going to make a groove. But what about if I want to make the groove, but it's not definite I'm going to make the groove? I can't do it. If I'm intending to do the labor on Shabbat, even if you don't know for sure you're going to do it, you're going to accomplish your act, you're going to accomplish making a groove. You can't intend to violate the Shabbat. So how could he say you could even to mitzaref, even to harden the steel, you could throw in a lot of water even to harden the steel? How could you have intention to do that? So the Gemara says it means something else. Eli itma, hachi itma. This is what it says. Omar Rav says, Lo shanu, that which the Mishnah says that you could go ahead, and I'll just speak out what the Gemara is going to say. The Gemara is going to say, when is something subject to hardening a pot? It's only if you fill up the pot to the top of the pot. Because what happens, a pot contains a certain amount of water. Let's say it has a certain amount of boiling water. When it has a certain amount of water in that pot, that part of the pot doesn't become so soft that then requires the hardening. It's the part of the pot that's from the time where the water ends in the pot till the top of the pot, which there's no water in it. It's just pot. It's just the pot. That part of the pot got heated up. So the Gemara is going to talk about. So the Gemara is going to say this allowance that you could put in cold water into this empty pot, is only if you don't put enough water to fill up the whole pot. If you don't throw in enough cold water to go from the bottom of the pot to the top of the pot. But if you threw in enough water to go from the bottom of the pot to the top of the pot, then that will be a problem. We'll see tomorrow more details about this. I don't want to be late. Everyone should, it's already, time flies, like they say, when you're having fun. It went like this, and have a Chodesh Tov. It should be a beautiful Chodesh. Hashem should answer our tefillot, and we should try to focus in on the davening, not to get distracted by the davening. There's a lot of distractions in life. People have a lot of things on their minds. Let's try not to get distracted.